We begin with John the Baptist and his beheading, right? And I believe in the lesson we had you read through all the different versions, all the different, right? And you saw that Matthew is not the most, it doesn't have the most information on this particular story. Which gospel had the most? Mark had the most, yeah. So the book of Mark covers a lot more information. That's found in Mark 6:14. Mark is the shortest book, but for some reason it goes into great detail on this particular passage and this story of John the Baptist's beheading. So let's just start in Matthew 14:1. We've got Herod, and he's given the title Tetrarch. Anybody look up, or did you discuss that terminology? Two different Greek words. The ark, the end of that, means to rule, arche, and the beginning of that is the number 4 in Greek. So 4 to rule, 4 rulers. So coming out of Herod the Great's dynasty. Herod the Great is the one that we read about early in Matthew when Jesus was born. He was a great builder. He was in charge of the entire kingdom. But when he died in 4 BC, his kingdom was originally, and it didn't last very long, but it was originally broken into 4 parts. Each of those 4 rulers over those 4 parts were called tetrarchs, one of 4 rulers. Does that make sense? So this is one of the rulers, Herod. His name is Antipas. Herod is a title, a ruler title. Antipas. And he was one of Herod the Great's sons. And he ruled over the Galilee region, so we read about him a lot in the Gospels later in Jesus' public ministry, because a lot of what Jesus does is up in that Galilee region. It so happened that Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch, seduced Herodias, his wife, but she wasn't his wife when he seduced her. He was Philip's wife, one of Herod's brothers. Does that make sense? And so Herodias ends up coming over and living with Herod Antipas in the Galilee region. And this is what John is, this is the situation that John is confronting when he says, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." There was a law that said if your brother's living, you cannot have his wife. There were laws that said if your brother dies, right? Especially to pass on the family name, you could marry your brother's wife. So this is in contrast to that. And as you can tell, he wasn't the nicest of guys. In fact, I might even call him evil and or wicked, based on just this one episode alone. But we have lots of other extra biblical ideas about who he is and what he did. But even though he was this pagan ruler, this evil gentleman, he apparently has a belief in a very Christian idea. And what was that? He has a belief in the resurrection. I don't know if you noticed that. Now, it wasn't Jesus' resurrection necessarily. He was talking about John the Baptist. And when Jesus shows up on the scene, he had already killed John the Baptist. But here's this other character doing some crazy miraculous things, and his conclusion is that this is John the Baptist come back from the dead. Which is kind of interesting if you think about it. We haven't quite gotten to it yet, but as Jesus starts preparing his own disciples, people we know are true believers in the God of the Old Testament, and beginning to lay out for them scriptural arguments out of the Old Testament about why this Messiah character would have to die and then would come back from the dead after 3 days. These believing disciples have a harder time believing in the resurrection than this Herod, who is a wicked gentleman. It just seems like it's a weird, right? So let's give the disciples a little bit of slack, maybe, and maybe even give yourself a little bit of slack as you try and contemplate things about the spiritual realm that maybe other people are understanding, but you're having a hard time coming to terms with. that struggle is, I think, a part of our human nature, a part of us not being able to see entirely clearly the things in the spiritual realm. I want to talk just briefly about the difference between a type and an antitype, because it's going to come up in this lesson a little bit. I'm going to bring out some examples of what I think are types and antitypes. So you've heard what a type is. Sometimes they're referred to as shadows. They're things that precede something else, and they give some idea of the character or nature of something that is to follow. So it's been defined as an image or a representation, a type, an image or a representation of something that will come to pass at a future time. So if that's the type, if the type is the first thing to come, and it gives you an idea of something yet to come, that something yet to come is called the antitype. Okay? And so what we have in the Old Testament are types, and they're oftentimes pointing to the ministry of Jesus. And if that's the relationship between an Old Testament type, Jesus then is the antitype, which seems kind of weird language. We don't use that language very often, but that's the way it plays out. But it doesn't just play out for Jesus' ministry. This terminology would play out for any type of representation or image of something that precedes another. So as we get into this story of John the Baptist, and we get to verse 3, verse 3 starts a flashback. So I don't know if you noticed in verse 1 and 2, we're kind of in the narrative of the day. When it starts verse 3, it says, "For when Herod had arrested." So from verses 3 till 12, you got this flashback. The author, Matthew, is going back in time and saying, this is why Herod came to that conclusion, is because of this situation. And what we have is, I mentioned earlier, I don't know if you remember a few chapters ago, Jesus was talking about John the Baptist, and he said, if you have ears to hear, eyes to see type idea, John the Baptist is, and what did he say? Elijah. John the Baptist is Elijah to come. Now, based on just that short description of the type antitype, who would be the type in that scenario? Who came first? Elijah. So Elijah would be the type, the Old Testament shadow. He had a ministry that somehow, when John the Baptist came to, John the Baptist fulfilled that idea that was foreshadowed. Make sense? So John is the antitype. Yeah? So as we go through, it's kind of interesting just to take a look at John the Baptist. When Jesus says he is Elijah, he's not, we've said this before, he's not literally saying this is Elijah come back from the dead and we renamed him John the Baptist and he looks different, right? We think he looks different because they had shut down his Facebook account by then, so we're not sure what Elijah looked like. But what Jesus is saying is John the Baptist is that antitype. If you go back to Elijah's ministry, you have a type of what John the Baptist is here to do. And so the reason I'm pointing this out is because in this scenario, verses 3 through 12, what we get is this story of John the Baptist having a run-in with a king and his evil wife. And for those of you that already know Elijah's story out of 1 Kings 18:19, you can go back there and kind of read through. Elijah had a run-in with an evil king and his wife, and the king was Ahab and the wife was Jezebel. Now, if you just have normal conversation with people about Ahab and Jezebel, the general consensus is that these two are pretty wicked people. And if you go back and read the story, you'll see, yes. And they threatened to kill Elijah. It didn't play out exactly the same as John the Baptist's end. But here what you have is, in one sense at least, when Jesus says John the Baptist is Elijah, one of the things I want you to consider, it's not just what John the Baptist says or just one part of his ministry. You need to look at the whole of John the Baptist's story. And the whole of his story is partly this run-in with this Herod, this king character, and an evil wife that are out to get him. And in that way, his ministry is the antitype of Elijah's ministry as well. When the mouth of God speaks the truth of God. What was the run-in with Elijah? Do you remember? Elijah, yeah, he had a run-in with the prophets of Baal in 18, but he had also called a drought on the land to get people's attention. He was speaking the truth of God to a people that didn't want to hear it. And the king and the wife were ahead of that. And that's exactly what John the Baptist is doing as well. And in fact, it says in verse 4, for John had been saying. It doesn't say that John said once, but it says that John had been saying. I don't know if you noticed that. What does that suggest to you? It's not just this one-time occurrence that he just in passing said, oh, you shouldn't be married to her. What is John doing? He's bringing this up over and over again in different settings until it became a burr in the saddle and they decided, we don't like this guy hanging around anymore, right? So, in that way, we need to think of John the Baptist being an antitype, okay, to the type of Elijah. So we've got this flashback to previous events in these verses. We've got John's persistence in verse 4. It's interesting if in the Mark passage, because I know you read it, we find out that the daughter of Herodias, the wife, does a dance and is promised. It's not brought out here in Matthew, but in Mark it's brought out that he says, I'll give you anything up to what? Half the kingdom. Now, half the kingdom's a pretty big deal. I mean, this financially, this is a pretty big deal. And what do we see? What do we see when given the choice of something very valuable, half the kingdom, or something else, John's head? She is willing to give up all of this for this one thing. Does that sound familiar at all? Somebody that's willing to give all of this personal possession up for this one thing. Does it sound like a parable that we read maybe in the last? There's two of them in a row about very valuable things, and when people find the valuable item of the kingdom of heaven, what will they be willing to do? Give up everything they own and purchase this one very valuable thing, right? Well, that parable plays on both sides of the coin. It's not just for the kingdom of heaven, but it's also for the kingdom of this world. People can be so sold out and view this world as being so valuable that they'd be willing to give up everything, their whole future, just for this. And so I found that interesting. In this character, if you weave the different gospels together, you get a picture, kind of an offsetting picture of the costly pearl or the hidden treasure from Matthew 13. So John the Baptist meets his end, and Jesus, when he hears about John, he withdraws and he goes to a secluded place, and then people find out about that, and they follow him there. And it says in verse 14, when he went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them, and he healed their sick. He felt compassion for them. This terminology, he felt compassion for, this is shepherding terminology. This is bringing out this idea of Jesus as shepherd. And if you're wondering, well, is that actually, if you go to the Mark account of the feeding of the 5,000, it says when Jesus went ashore, he saw the large crowd, he felt compassion for them, same line as in Matthew, right? Now look what follows. Because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So a good shepherd is that shepherd that has compassion. In our theme of type and antitype for this chapter, I'm going to propose to you that this is another example, the shepherding aspect of Jesus' ministry is another example of how Matthew is bringing out the qualities of Moses, the Old Testament. Okay? So I'm going to take you back to a chapter in Numbers. We're going to be in Numbers chapter 27, verse 17. Here, Moses is having a conversation with the Lord, and he's asking that there be a man appointed over the congregation who will go out and come in before them, and who will lead them out and bring them in, so that, this is after Moses goes away, who's going to succeed him is the question. And Moses is bantering back and forth with the Lord, saying, you need to give them somebody that will lead them, bring them out and bring them in. That's shepherding language, right? Take the flock out to field, bring them back in to safety. So that the congregation of the Lord will not be like sheep that have no shepherd. Okay? And as we go back and look, as Moses as the shepherd of the Old Testament, if he precedes Jesus' ministry, he's the type, right? And Moses is a man that fed bread, because that's the story we're in, the feeding of the 5,000. Moses is a man that fed bread to the people of Israel, did he not? How did Moses go about doing that? He asked the Lord, this is after they come out of Egypt, right? He asked the Lord for sustenance, and the Lord provides what's called manna, right? Bread from heaven. John chapter 6 has a whole discussion. Jesus has a whole discussion on this as the bread of life. Moses, how does Moses feed his sheep? Moses, as a shepherd, calls upon the Lord, and the Lord creates the food for the flock. Moses is the type. He is a foreshadowing of what's to come. But one of the things about anti, that word preview that comes before type, antitype, it can mean a continuation or the continuation of a foreshadowing thought or circumstance. But anti also in some ways can be used as an opposite or an against word, right? Anti-disestablishmentarianism. Right. Some of you can spell that, right? Not me. So anti can also mean an against, and there's a sense in that word, while it can mean a foreshadowing and a continuation of a ministry that was in part fulfilled, the anti, the against, has some idea of there's something different about this thing that comes next, this antitype. It's not exactly the same, right? So if Moses fed the sheep as a shepherd character, and by feeding the sheep, the way he did that was call upon God, and God himself provided the bread. Jesus is the antitype of that type. So what's different about Jesus? He's still that shepherding character, right? Does he feed his people bread? In this story, exactly, right? But what's the difference? When it comes time for Jesus to feed the people, how does he go about it?
He gives thanks.
He gives thanks, he blesses. Does he pray to God and say, God, you need to feed, you need to provide? No. It's from his very hands, right? That he is the one creating the bread and giving it to the disciples who give it to the people, who distribute it. So, in this antitype of Jesus' ministry, a fulfillment of Moses' ministry, the difference is Jesus doesn't pray to God because he is God. That's the conclusion you're to come to. And if you were a Jewish person and you picked up on the theme of shepherd and you know your Moses character well and you know the story because it's your personal family history, that Old Testament, you're going to see Jesus and you're going to read these stories, and the conclusion you come to is this is an antitype. You might not say it this way, right? But this is the antitype of this character that I know so well in the Old Testament named Moses. But he's not just like Moses, he is better than Moses, right? He's the complete fulfillment of that idea. So he's got manna that's better than Moses's. In this example of the feeding of the 5,000, you may have noticed he ordered the people to sit down on the grass. Did you notice that? Sit down on the grass. I thought that was interesting. He could have said it in any number of ways. He didn't even have to mention that he asked them to sit down. Wasn't it just implied that they would eventually sit down? Isn't that what you do when you eat? Don't answer that question, because if you say you stand, that doesn't play into my scenario very well. It's interesting because earlier we've got this compassionate shepherding idea. Mark brings out that he thought of them as sheep without a shepherd, so he's further expanding. Mark is further expanding it. And here, the shepherd is ordering or telling the people to lie down on the grass. And what type of grass is it? Well, if you go over to Mark chapter 6, he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, does this remind anybody of anything? There's a psalm in the Old Testament that explains God in terms of his shepherding characteristics. And in that psalm, he says, he makes me, he orders me to lie down in green pastures. Isn't that kind of cool? We've got Jesus fulfilling that psalm. In Matthew and Mark and the other gospel writers actually going about it, letting us know. This word for sit down, if I was to be able to figure out how to get my cursor right there and click on that, it literally means to recline, to lie down, as you would at maybe a table that was close to the ground. They didn't have any tables, but they were reclining when they ate. He ordered the people to lie down in green pastures, and he fed them. I think that's pretty cool. Yeah, he is the good shepherd. He's like Moses. He has compassion for the sheep, but he's greater than Moses because he is the creator of the bread that sustains. Matthew 14:19. What we have here in this last part of this story of the feeding of the 5,000, we've got kind of a preview for the Last Supper. And you may be thinking to yourself, where's he going with the Last Supper? But I'm just going to point out to you some verbal, some linguistic ties to the Last Supper account, and suggest to you, it may be a new thought. This may be one of those new things that you hadn't considered before. After he had them lie down on the grass, it says he took the 5 loaves. I think I had you notice these, right? The verbs. What actions did he take? He took the loaves. He blessed the food. He broke the loaves. And he gave it to the disciples. So he took, he blessed, he broke, he gave. Right? There's a tie-in with the terminology of the Last Supper. And in Matthew 26, verse 26, it says, while they were eating, so we're now at the end of Jesus' ministry, we'll get there eventually in a few weeks. While they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it to the disciples. Now, lest you think that I'm trying to tie two things together, let me ask you just an obvious question. Do you think when Matthew wrote this that he understood that he was using the same terminology when he wrote these 2 episodes? Or was it just by chance that it was in the exact same order, in the exact same setting of bread and food? I just propose to you that Matthew is a fairly well organized person. His arguments are well thought out. He's been telling these stories verbally for years. And by the time it gets to the point where writing it down, and we're the benefits of that, beneficiaries of that. By the time it gets to the time of writing it, he has told this story hundreds, if not thousands of times to people, over and over again. And he has worked out the details and the terminology of all of them. So, the Lord's Supper, the feeding of the 5,000. What's interesting about this is in the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus does these four actions, and he ends up giving the bread to the disciples. And what do the disciples end up doing? They are the ones that distribute out to the people, right? Now, if there is a linguistic connection that I'm supposing here, if we're supposed to see that connection, we're here at the Lord's Supper. At the end of Jesus' ministry, he's about to go away. He's got a death, burial, resurrection, and ascension in the meantime, right? But he's about to be off the scene, and who's going to be left? The disciples are the ones that are left. And what is Jesus doing in this Last Supper? He's breaking the bread. He's blessing it, right? He's giving it to the disciples. And the instructions are, whenever you get together, do this, feed my sheep. Words that he gave to who? Peter. Feed my sheep. Feed my flock. Disciples, I'm giving you the food, the spiritual food, the sustenance to save not just the 5,000. Really, it was probably 15,000 because you got women and children, and those are rough estimates. But you got 5,000 men, not including women and children, the text says. The disciples in the Last Supper are not tasked with feeding the 15,000. Who are they tasked with feeding? All of humanity. The feeding of the 5,000 is just a test run to get the disciples prepared for the miracle that the gospel brings to the world. Isn't that kind of cool? Yeah. And they don't get it the first time, so next chapter we've got a feeding of 4,000, and they go through the whole rigmarole again, right? But those are the disciples we know. Maybe they should have gotten Herod, right? He would have believed right off the bat, because, no, I'm just joking. So this feeding of the 5,000 story, it's kind of like that Last Supper, kind of like that communion of even when we get together and take communion, we're kind of at that same table, at that Last Supper table. Kind of almost takes us back to the feeding of the 5,000, the type of the Last Supper, which is the anti-type. Do you see that language being used there? They all ate and were satisfied. I'm going to suggest to you also that there was another miracle that you may not have considered here. They all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up leftover pieces that were 12 full baskets. Interestingly enough, the word for baskets in this story is a smaller basket, usually used to carry one or maybe two small meals. How many people have ever had a big Thanksgiving dinner at your house? Yeah? What's the most people you've cooked for? 20? Maybe 30? Maybe if it was a church event, you may have gotten into the low 100s. Think about the preparation, the guesstimating that you're having to do, even with a meal for 30 people. How much? Because what I don't know when I'm cooking on my barbecue is I don't know how hungry the people are going to be when they arrive. I don't know if they're on diets. I don't know if they're gluten-free. I don't know majority of the things about my audience when I'm the cook. So I'm guessing. And I'll have you know, as my time in youth ministry, I had people over to my house, and as we prepared the meal, we were guessing who's going to show up. How hungry are they going to be? And sometimes Well, we cooked hot dogs, so it was a little bit easier. So I don't want to make you think I'm just saying he's chef or anything. But sometimes we had a whole pot full of hot dogs left over at the end of the night. And we're trying to give them away to anybody and everybody will take them. Ziploc them and get them out of here. Sometimes about halfway through the night, we're running to the store for more hot dogs. Wow. Right? Because more kids showed up and man, they are hungry tonight. Okay? Unbeknownst to us. I'm just going to suggest to you that there's a miracle happening here. That Jesus is preparing food, and it's just not random amounts of food. He's preparing the exact amount of food that will satisfy 15,000 people, most estimates would guess. And what's left over? How many small baskets full are left over? 12. One for each of the servers that had not yet taken time to eat. Everybody there is fully satisfied. Now that is a type. What's it a type of? It's a type of how Jesus can completely satisfy our spiritual hunger. And there's nothing left over. It's exactly appropriate. So I don't know how hungry you are tonight, but I can guarantee you, as you sit there right now, whatever your spiritual hunger, Jesus is available and ready. Amen. You can go to Him and you can be fed. Let's finish with this walking on the water. John tells us that after this feeding of the 5,000 in John 6:15, that the people were intending to take Jesus by force and make him king. You can imagine. Gerald, if you ever cook for 15,000 and there's only 12 baskets full, I'll vote for you for king, okay? We'll have to change our constitution, but you got my vote, okay? And so that's what the people were doing. And he's sending the disciples away on a boat, right? And he goes and separates himself and prays. And there's this big windstorm that catches the Sea of Galilee. These are common. This is not a rainstorm. This is a windstorm. As wind comes off the Sahara down through the Rift Valley and goes into the below sea level of the Sea of Galilee, oftentimes windstorms catch up. And what it says is they had been rowing all night. It was in the fourth watch of the night, which is between 3 and 6 a.m. And they had only made it about 1/3 to 1/2 of their way to the destination that they had intended. Mark says they were in the middle of the sea. John 6:19 says they were about 25 to 30 stadia. Most translations turn that into 3 to 4 miles offshore. They were literally in the middle of their journey after having gone all night. So if you've ever been on a boat with a motor that's not quite powerful enough to go upstream or against the wind, right? They've got a headwind and they're just being tossed about. So you can imagine, these are fishermen, they grew up on the water, some of them. And you can imagine that they are afraid. And as the night goes on, their separation from the Lord becomes more apparent to them. Their need for Him becomes more apparent. And they see Jesus coming in the fourth watch of the night. And they conclude that He's a ghost. So if somebody's concluding that somebody they're looking at is a ghost, what are they concluding about that person? That they've died. That there's been a death and that person has come back and that's a ghost that we're seeing. So the text doesn't really say it outright, but by them saying they concluded he was a ghost, in the back of their heads, you've got to be wondering that somewhere back there, they are saying to themselves, Jesus has died. And this is not him, but this is his spirit. Right? Jesus comes up to them, and he says in verse 27, take courage. And in our translations, it usually says, it is I. In the Greek, it's ego eimi, which is, I am, which is a claim to deity. It's the name of God from the Old Testament. When Moses says, hey, I go into Egypt and they ask me who sent me, what's the response Moses gets? I am sent you. The ever-present one, the one that was and is to come. I am. He's always in the present. Jesus comes on a storm after the whole night of rowing. They're terrified. They think they're looking at a spirit, a ghost. And he says, take courage. I am. What's he claiming? He's claiming to be Moses. He's claiming to be one better than Moses, right? He's claiming to be very God himself. It's a claim of deity. In the next verse, Peter says, if it is you, unfortunate translation, I think a better translation, as far as I can tell, it would be, Lord, since it is you. It's actually a statement of faith that Peter is making. Since it is you, since it is who you claim to be, command me this. Great statement of faith. And then he gets into some trouble, does he not? And what's his solution when he finds himself in trouble? What words does he use? It's a very simple call. And I'm just going to suggest to you that if it worked for Peter, it can work in any situation. So I'm not sure where life has you, what storm, what you've been fighting against, how long it's taken you to get nowhere, where you find yourself terrified. But Lord, save me, it works. It worked then, and in the ever-present state of who God is, it works today. And guess what? It'll work tomorrow too. So, they got in the boat, the wind stopped. Did you notice that? And they came to a conclusion. Those in the boat, what was their conclusion? Certainly, you are God's son. You are who you claim to be. Nobody does the things you do. Nobody out of the Old Testament is able to do what you've done. They may have hinted towards this, but your ministry is greater than any ministry we've ever seen or read about. And that's the conclusion that hopefully the readers today can come to as well. In the same way that I suggested that this feeding of the 5,000 was tied back to the Last Supper, I'll just toss this out there, not that it's written in granite or anything, but something to consider, new thought maybe. Jesus sent them out on a boat and he went up to a secluded place to pray. That's kind of similar to the situation in the garden after the Last Supper, when Jesus separated himself for a time of prayer and left the disciples on their own. And then Jesus got arrested, and for a period of time, until his resurrection, they felt alone. Their world was kind of topsy-turvy. And when he showed back up on the night after the third day resurrection, what was their thought when they saw him? They thought he was a spirit. Now, this might be a stretch, but I just wanted, this whole story might be a progression that Jesus is using to help prepare his disciples for the emotional impact of what his actual death, burial, resurrection will bring to their lives. He's giving them a small test. We often say about our children, right? I would rather have them experience something at home first and maybe fail at it than just throw them out there in the world. And I think maybe Jesus is doing that in little bits and pieces along the way. He's giving people a taste that are close to him of what emotions they're going to go through and the end result of how he will fulfill their needs. Matthew 14:34. Well, let's end this thing. I just wanted you to notice as they crossed over and came to this other place and got off the boat, there's people there who were sick, and they implored him that they might just touch the what? The fringe of his cloak. What are they wanting to touch? That tassel on the corner of his garment. Where have we seen this before? Where have we talked about this? the hemorrhaging woman, correct? In the healing ministries in 8 and 9, those healing ministry chapters, this was not an isolated incident. Other people had that Old Testament prophecy that the Son of Righteousness would come with healing in its wings. And they believed it as well. And as many as touched it were what? Cured. Yeah. So all we have to do, no matter where you find yourself today, we just need to reach out to Jesus, whether that's reaching out to touch the corner of his hem, his garment, or reaching out into the storm. But be assured that he can bring calm and healing and a revelation in a new way to your life, that he is the Son of God. He is very God himself. He is worthy of your worship. And it's a reminder at the same time that we can have our faith, but we can also have a tinge of doubt right alongside our faith. And we can be in the midst of a storm, and even with all that, we can still be cared for by our Savior. Let's pray. Dear God, thanks for this chapter, chapter 14, and the things that you've showed us about who you are, the character that you bring to the table. And God, we find ourselves hungry, whether it's not today, it may be tomorrow, it maybe it was yesterday. But we are a hungry people. And we know you are the supplier of food. And so we are in your presence. Help us to remain there. Help us to reach out to you instead of other sources of nourishment that we might be tempted to. Remind us who you are early and often. And keep us close. In Jesus' name, amen.